All right. Thank you, everyone. We have a lot to cover. We want to talk a bit about the war with Hamas and Hezbollah, obviously, the role of regional actors, Israel's domestic politics, US-Israel relations, and the impact of the November elections on all of this. So we have a lot to cover. Let's go back exactly to this day 1 year ago. The biggest issue for many Israelis was the judicial reform. A deal with Saudi Arabia was on the table, and there was no sense of imminent threat of an attack from Gaza, as even Israel's chairman of the Joint Chiefs said, Hamas is deterred. And then everything changed. So Nadav, I want to start with you. You published exclusive reports and testimonies from victims of October 7. And I wanted to start, if you can talk a bit about the mood on the ground in Israel and the trauma Israelis are facing, starting with the October 7 attacks and throughout really the past year.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you so much for having this event on this somber day. So, for Israel, this is a trauma like no other that goes into the very foundational idea of the formation of Israel. And that is a safe haven and a national home for the Jewish people. What happened in October 7 is something that many Israelis, me included, could never assume to have happened. That the IDF, that is really seen and is, even today, the main defender of the Jewish people, not only of Israel, or this is how Israelis see it, failed in its mission to defend Israel and Israelis, and people were taken out of their beds in their pajamas, and kids and children, 4-year-old, were taken into Gaza or murdered on the spot. And I think what we all saw is what happens when the IDF fails for 6 hours. Mm-hmm. This is what happens in the Middle East when the IDF fails. This caused an immense sense of insecurity and a national trauma that will echo for generations. And even though we have seen the success of the Israeli defense apparatus in recent weeks, no victory can erase that failure. And believe me that when I'm saying this as an Israeli journalist, but also as an Israeli patriot, and as someone who speaks with senior sources within the defense apparatus. None of them will excuse themselves, will have this sort of a moral discount to that failure. Another thing that Israelis felt almost immediately is that the concept that one can live side by side with fundamentalist organizations, pseudo-states, like the one that developed with Hamas in Gaza, like the one that installed itself in southern Lebanon and indeed in Lebanon with Hezbollah, those organizations in which their creed, their stated aim is to destroy the country next to them, that this could never exist and for Israelis to be safe. Who are these Israelis? Those who live on the narrow borders of Israel. And that has changed everything in the political sphere in Israel. When people talk about a political solution, when people talk about a two-state solution, this has all shifted as a result of this national trauma and this understanding that is flowing from within the Israeli society that you cannot coexist if on the other side of the fence there are people who are really dedicated to the idea of destroying you. And ever since then, we have seen war. October 7 isn't over. Not only for the hostages that are still held in the Hamas tunnels and are being tortured and abused, But it's not over for Israelis because Haifa was bombed this evening by Hezbollah, and Tveria was bombed this evening, Israel time, by Hezbollah. And I have friends that not only serve today in the reserves, but their kids serve in the reserves. And sometimes, you know, we're starting to hear about 3 generations of people who serve in the army. So the war is very much here, and it's still echoing through our society and will echo through, I expect, for the history of Israel, a day that you remembered in infamy.
Thank you, Nadav. So from an analytical perspective, October 6, 2023 was probably essentially the last day of the old Middle East. We look at US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan famously stated in Foreign Affairs that the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. That was back in fall of 2023 before the attacks. Dennis, over the past year, we've learned a lot about what happened that day, the motivations, the calculations of Hamas and Yahya Sinwar. So let's talk a little bit about it. What do we know now about why Hamas attacked Israel? Why on October 7? Why in that way?
First of all, I think we should always understand there's never a single motivation. There's a complex of motivations. In Sinwar's case, Sinwar is an ideologue. He is someone who believes Israel should not exist. He believes that he could create a strategy to ensure that it could collapse. He developed a capability which was largely unseen by the Israelis, maybe not all of the intelligence establishment. We now know there were those who were warning, but certainly because there was a groupthink within the Israeli military and security and intelligence establishment, the assumptions they had led them to create a kind of prism through which they interpreted all the information. All the information reflected their view. They're deterred. Sinwar has a prisoner's mentality. He likes to build pressure on us so that we will extend the amount of areas where fishermen can go. We'll allow more workers to come in. Everything was read through that prism. And Sinwar had an interest in sort of stoking that. Sinwar was a guy who spent 22 years in Israeli jails, became fluent in Hebrew, wanted to know his enemy, paid a lot of attention to the Israeli media, probably read you on a regular basis. And again, this was the work of several years. Now, what was the immediate precipitating event? Probably the reality that there was going to be a breakthrough between Saudi Arabia and Israel, because that was going to transform the region. That was going to build a coalition that integrated the Israelis in a formal way into, in a sense, an alliance or a coalition of countries that would be arrayed against the Iranians, that represented countries who actually want to have a very different kind of future, resilient economies and the like. And so frustrating that was certainly part of his interest. The timing, I think, was also influenced by what he read or what he believed would be support that he would get from the Iranians and Hezbollah. He believed that a scenario that he triggered would look something like the following. Hamas would carry out this onslaught into Israel. Hezbollah had 150,000 rockets, would begin to fire them not just in the north, but throughout all of Israel. The West Bank would explode, and you'd have the equivalent of a third intifada. The Israeli Arabs would rise up. There would be an Iranian support. And this would actually lead to not only a dramatic defeat of Israel, but would basically lead ultimately to the collapse of Israel. Mm-hmm. This guy sees himself like he's a latter-day Salah ad-Din. He sees himself in heroic terms, and he sees himself as a martyr. You know, when I used to deal with Arafat, there would be times when we'd be having tough meetings, which were not always the exception. And at some point, he would say to me, "I'm ready to be a martyr for the cause." And I would say to him, "Yeah, I don't think so." Well, Sinwar is ready to be a martyr for the cause. And right now, for those who think that you might still get a hostage deal, The scenario he wanted to produce, he now sees, well, maybe after a year, maybe it'll actually happen. Look what's going on between Israel and Iran. Okay, what the Israelis have done, yes, they've weakened Nasrallah, but maybe this exchange between the Israelis and the Iranians will erupt into a wider war, which he's always sought. So he certainly is going to wait to see what happens with regard to that. And you know, I don't see any near-term change from that standpoint, but I also think that, you know, in the end, he didn't envision where they are today. He didn't envision that the entire Hamas military would basically be dismantled. He didn't envision that most of their military infrastructure, meaning weapons depots, weapons labs, weapon production facilities, the tunnels, that a majority of that would be dismantled. So let's say he might have been very smart in terms of understanding how to play on the Israeli misperceptions, but he himself miscalculated in terms of what was going to happen.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to this in a second, in the miscalculation. But first, let me go to Jane. So this was obviously a massive intelligence failure in Israel, but also a U.S. Failure in terms of thinking about the Middle East, thinking about Hamas. What do you think did Israel, but especially the United States, you think, what did they get wrong from a strategic perspective?
Well, first, I'm delighted to be starting my week at IGP.
Yeah,
and
thank you to have you.
And
yes.
thank you to you and Hillary for including me. I have to say that tomorrow is a complicated day for me. Let me explain. 51 years ago tomorrow, I was giving birth to my oldest son and discussing with the obstetrician how the war was going in Israel. So, as you know, do the math. Last October 7th was his 50th birthday. And it was enormously complicated to see the tragedy and sadness, but also to understand that he'd reached this huge milestone. So he's not here tonight, but tomorrow, Brian, happy birthday. Yeah. On the subject of how did we miss this and how did Israel miss this? I was in Congress, as you said, on 9/11. I was in a group, I was a very senior member of the House Intelligence Committee. I had been a member of something called the National Commission on Terrorism. We had predicted a major attack on US soil. We were one of 3 commissions that did that. We testified before the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And on 9/10/2001, I had lunch with Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer, who was later the US Viceroy or whatever his title was in Iraq. And we said, why is no one listening? Well, the next day they were listening. And there's something comparable, not to say that 9/11 was as important, although it was very important in the US psyche, but the US is a bigger country. And somehow I think all of Israel was attacked. And on 9/11, some of our most significant places, including the city, was attacked. But at any rate, I don't think, Karen, with respect, I don't really think this was an intelligence failure. I think it was a political and military failure. The intel was there, and it is now reported that a intel cell of women operating, I think, 20 miles from Tel Aviv had seen the training going on in the West Bank, and they'd seen the troops amassing along the border. And also, I believe, it's reported, I don't have classified information about this, that the invasion plan was available. And again, a few women, I hate to make this point, but hey, were trying to get attention in the government and did not get attention. In addition to that, with the unrest in Israel at the time, many of the troops were pulled off of the border with Gaza and were on the border of the West Bank and dealing with substantial unrest in Israel. So I think that had the intelligence been listened to, they wouldn't have been pulled away, and they would have been much more alert. And frankly, other things that were pretty shameful, like the fact that the surveillance cameras could be taken out by simple drones. That's embarrassing. And that no orders were given, as you said, for hours and hours to react. So I think it was a massive military and government failure. And I do think, I'm not arguing the fact that it has been an enormous trauma to Israeli society. I completely sympathize with that. But I think we'll get into this. I think there are some opportunities now to do a course correction, to think about a way forward that would make Israel much more secure, and a strategy for that seems to me to be missing.
We'll definitely get to this. Nadav, anything that you want to add on the intelligence failures, things that we just have been reported, even you reported?
First of all, I do think it was first and foremost an intelligence failure, and we defer on that. And let me explain why. The way that the IDF works is that it's not supposed to take any risks. It's such a small piece of land, and basically this is not a country in which, in general, people are angry at soldiers that wake them up at night. They're usually angry because their soldiers didn't wake them up at night. And that's a major difference. Now, it's not always the case. And what I said now is anecdotal, but I'm trying to give you an idea of how Israel's security doctrine works. And the way it does work is that you don't take chances, because it's such a small country, and because you have enemies, sworn enemies, that are there to destroy you. Israel knows what is Hamas, has fought with Hamas. Hamas has been blowing buses in Israel since the 1990s. It's no surprise, and it's a sworn enemy, it's a mortal enemy. And then you have the exact situation that you have seen before, that we have seen, that you have studied, Karen, and you have wrote about, that you have all the data there, always in retrospect.
Oh.
In retrospect, everybody is a genius. So let me tell you something about this, as a person who speaks with these generals, who are assuming responsibility and who are going to resign, unlike, or have already resigned, unlike the Israeli politicians. None of those has resigned until now. If they would have known that there is a chance not for an October 7 attack, but for a substantial, specific terror attack on the fence with Gaza, they would immediately put their entire troops there, on the highest alert, because this is how it works. The amazing, the terrible failure here is that they didn't think that to begin with. And now afterwards, of course, you have these reports. As Jane mentioned, I don't agree with much of what you said, but you were absolutely right about the women. Many of those intelligence officers were women, either the women stationed there on field intelligence, on the border, or women studying Hamas, but many other intelligence officers that thought that this is a possibility, that Hamas will have this attack. And the problem with the failure was as such. In Israel, most of the decision mechanism within the IDF and the political sphere did not think that Hamas has the ability. It was never about the intention, but the ability to have this attack actually operate and manifest itself. And why didn't they? And nobody's going to write this, because it's not such a great story, what I'm going to say right now. So I detailed this at length with specific exclusives about this document written and what happened during the night and what kind of signal did we get out of Gaza that we should have read otherwise. But here's the thing. You usually do not assume that your enemy is going to commit suicide. So each time that you have this discussion, the first rationale in the discussion is that the leader there of that pseudo state, even though he's a fundamentalist, doesn't want Gaza to be occupied, he doesn't want to die, and he doesn't want to have such harm inflicted on him. And this is, by the way, the same assumption that the United States has when it doesn't assume that a terror group that wants to harm the United States will use the southern border in order to face a full-fledged invasion to murder as many Americans as they can, because the US is so powerful. And this was the assumption here. And this assumption has failed. And it has failed because we are dealing with people who have really and truly, and this is something that is, it really pains us to try and explain sometimes to audience. And Dennis knows this, and Jay knows this, and Karen, you definitely do, that they do not act sometimes according to the same kind of calculus rationale that we sometimes maintain. And for Sinwar, to an extent, because he's a Salahuddin, it was worth it. Because now he is part of history already, and this is probably what he wanted. And this assumption is the assumption that led to the Israeli mistake, the thinking that the other side, as fundamentalist as they are, is rational and will not commit suicide.
And this is true of many, many intelligence failure in the history of Israel and the history of the United States, is this assumption about rationality, and we call it a mirror imaging. You kind of look at the calculation, that what you would make in the situation, and would just assume that the adversary would do the same.
Two points.
Yes, 2 points on that.
One, in 73, same assumption.
Conception.
Right.
The idea was they know they will be defeated. No reason they're going to go ahead and attack because they know they're going to lose. Second point, in the IDF and in the intelligence community, they believed October 7th was going to come in the north. They were focused on the threat there because this is what they thought Hezbollah was going to try to do. They looked at there, and they built up a presence there. Because of this particular government and because of the weight of the settler movement in this government, they built up significantly the presence in the West Bank because violence had gone up significantly. And in the South, they felt, we don't have a problem there. The problem would be tunnels. We took care of the tunnels. That was it. The 9/11 Commission said there was a failure of imagination. Same thing here.
Jane,
So let me add that I agree with what you said, and I agree with, call it a failure of imagination. I wouldn't call it an intelligence failure, only because, at least in the US, intelligence analysts tell what they know to policymakers who make the policy. So I would definitely call it a policy failure. But it could happen again here. It's a good warning. I just chaired something called the Commission on National Defense Strategy, and we think that the world is ever more dangerous, and many this coalition of grievance, or whatever you want to call it, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, is intending serious, or could intend serious harm here. And for example, as a precursor to a Chinese annexation or invasion of Taiwan, there could be a massive cyber attack in this country. And we're not ready, because we think we're so powerful that it can't happen. Well, look what Hurricane Helene just did to North Carolina. Yes, it could happen.
So before we get to the north, let's talk one more question about Gaza. So we're now, it doesn't look like a ceasefire is in the cards at the moment. But how does it end? How does it end for Israel in terms of getting the hostages back? Dennis, what can you tell us about the prospects of
There
that?
is no simple answer to this, because Sinwar probably has no interest in giving all the hostages back. As long as he has hostages around him, that's probably his best insurance policy. But I think you can change the frame of this. The administration, for what I would call moral and logical reasons, has pursued an approach which was get a hostage deal. A hostage deal creates a pause,
right.
3 phases and a pause. That allows you to fix the humanitarian situation. And if you get the pause, it'll allow you to finalize the Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. And that will require an end to the war, and that'll be important enough to Prime Minister Netanyahu that he'll want to do it. The only problem, while moral and logical, the only problem was it made Yahya Sinwar the arbiter of the whole process. So I don't think you can ever build a strategy around assuming that Yahya Sinwar is going to do what you want. Right. So that's sort of what the approach has been. The alternative would be, instead of thinking about a hostage deal being the basis of an end to the war, think about an end to the war as a way to get the hostages released. Mm-hmm. Bibi Netanyahu was just at the UN and he said, we've destroyed 90% of all their rockets. He described how they've destroyed most of the Hamas military. It's true. Israel is not far from a situation where it could actually declare success. Hamas is no longer military. Most of its military infrastructure, the weapons labs, the production facilities, the tunnels, most of that has been destroyed. Now, if we created a tangible set of mechanisms that could show there'll be no smuggling, because Gaza was an open-air prison for the people who lived there, but it was not an open-air prison for Hamas. They got whatever they needed. You don't build 350 miles of tunnels, or probably 30,000 tons of cement, unless you can get whatever you wanted. The weapons that they had. I went to one of the bases in the south of Israel where they bring all the captured weapons. It's unbelievable. These were all basically being produced there. So if they can't reconstitute themselves, if most of what they had is destroyed, and if we can create, and there's a readiness on the part of a number of Arab countries now to play a role in the day after, assuming you get to the day after, why not go for reaching an agreement with the Prime Minister of Israel on here's what it takes to be able to declare success. And you can say, we're prepared now to end the war provided the hostages are released. Let's say Sinwar doesn't release the hostages. The position of Hamas all along was, end the war, we release the hostages. There's a recent poll out that shows that 7% of the Gazans, the Palestinians in Gaza, would support Hamas retaining control in Gaza. If, in a circumstance where Israel says we're ready to end the war and Hamas doesn't, the kind of pressure you're going to see politically, psychologically, will be very different from Palestinians, from Arabs. Israel takes more of the high ground, which they have lost almost completely. This, I think, is an approach that allows you to begin to at least create the possibility of ending the war. End the war, you'll be able to do, I think, a Saudi deal. That begins to really transform the region. And you can do it because right now, think about where Israel is. They faced a threat from Hamas, which they don't face today. Hezbollah is not finished, but Hezbollah is in complete disarray. Yes, they're firing rockets into the north, but they had, at the outset of this, 150 or 140,000 rockets. It is quite remarkable they're not firing barrages of rockets at Tel Aviv. It can't be because all that's been destroyed. They are in complete disarray. They have no command control. There are no communications they can trust. If they get an order, they don't know where it's coming from. It could be coming from the Israelis. They're focused on their own survival.
Right, and I want to get to Hezbollah. So really, recently, the Israeli government ended a fourth war aim, which is really the return of 60,000 Israeli citizens to their home in the north. Now, we can argue whether the decision early in the war to evacuate people from the north was the right one to begin with. But now we are in the midst of an air campaign and a ground incursion. In class, we tend to teach our students, how do you then connect the military gains that you make with political goals? So Nadav, to you, how does Israel convert the gains that's on the battlefield with what they're trying to achieve, with is the return of Israelis to the northern towns?
To the north, and of course the return of the hostages, as Dennis just mentioned. And the thing these things are of course connected. Look, many people remember that Israel was attacked on October 7, but Israel was also attacked on October 8. And that decision, if you would have watched international media, would have seemed to be, an uncomfortable byproduct of the war in the south. No, this was a strategic decision by Nasrallah that wasn't updated with Sinwar's plan to invade Israel. And he decided, and he made a miscalculation, to join the war and try to keep some sort of a calculus of sorts in which he will attack to this and this rate. And it's the IDF that decided to escalate in the north. And they said so, by the way, this is on the record, that the IDF said, we're going to escalate until we can get our civilians back in the north, like Israel did at the south. So I should explain that people in the south, in those kibbutzim that were completely destroyed, did not get back to their houses. Their houses are burned down, basically, and even the infrastructure is damaged. But people who want to return to the south, to those towns, who are still within physical range of Hamas missiles, if it has any rockets or missiles, can return back. This is not the same thing as in the north. And I traveled many times during this war, both to the south and the north. And the north is, you feel that it's much more dangerous. And you felt that. Why? Because Hezbollah wasn't actually dealt with. Now, if Israel indeed managed to severely hurt Hezbollah in ways that are strategic, killing Nasrallah and killing their central command, and also having, this is of course much more covered than the 7 hours operation of the Israeli Air Force, in which they destroyed about 50% of the missiles and rockets, attacking 1,600 targets in a synchronized manner, and then you have the pager attack. So you have here both the psychological optimum and you have actual achievements. How do you bring this into a point in which you can actually end and declare victory when Hezbollah and Hamas are saying, we will fight till the end? So I think Dennis gave us an answer here. Basically, during the Vietnam War, declare victory and pull out. Dennis didn't say that. He said, declare victory and then see what happens with the other side. But the problem with this is that it seems that even now, after Hezbollah was hit to this extent, after Gaza was taken by the IDF and we see the mass devastation there, even after that, the axis of the resistance, the so-called axis of resistance in the region, not one part of it is right now slowing down or giving us signals that they're willing to end this together. And what I mean is for the Iranians, for the Iran supreme leader to say, we had enough. And it's a decision. Again, it's a strategic decision. And they didn't make that decision. Some people would argue, who can make this decision in Hezbollah right now? And who can make this decision with Hamas right now? And I think that we do lack, with the national leadership in Israel, any coherent strategy of exit. But my main problem is that we lack this coherent strategy from the world's only superpower. And we have lacked this strategy from the beginning, to say there is only a deal, only a ceasefire deal. That's our only alternative. And I heard this is on the record, this was said on the record. There is no other option but a ceasefire deal. It's one thing for the Israelis to say, we're going to fight until victory, but it's a completely different thing when the US doesn't have anything tangible at hand. And I'd be really interested to hear from you, because you have much more experience with the US government than I do. How do these things end if the Americans themselves don't know how to end them?
So Jane, let's go to you. Maybe you have a good answer to that.
Of course I have a good answer. No, well, I have multiple answers. First of all, Dennis and I were in Gaza back in the day, in the late 90s, with Bill and Hillary Clinton, when to inaugurate an airport and a hotel, and USAID had a facility, and everything was peaceful. And then we went to Ramallah, and Dennis will...
That airport didn't survive.
We went to Ramallah.
The second intifada.
The second intifada.
Okay. We went to Ramallah, where I always forget the name of the group, the Palestinian National Congress?
The Palestinian National Council, but
Council.
It was actually in Gaza.
It
was in Gaza.
Okay.
Where they
amended its charter to eliminate the clause calling for the annihilation of Israel. And Dennis cried. I remember. I saw him. And what the tragedy is, that was then, and this is now. That's one point. Second point, I love what Dennis said, that you have to have a strategy of what winning looks like, and then the hostage is a piece of that, not a strategy for a ceasefire only. But I remember learning back in the day that the people on the ground have to want the deal, not just the people here on the stage. And I don't think Bibi wants any deal. I don't care what it is. I mean, a full pardon, prime minister in perpetuity, I think he would still prefer war. I do. And I think that is part of the tragedy here. I mean, we all saw this movie called Iraq, and we all saw the movie called Staying in Afghanistan after we had accomplished the mission that Congress said. I voted for that mission. And even after we took down Osama bin Laden, we stayed. Endless wars. And I think endless wars end up radicalizing populations and not just putting Israel at risk, which is something I dearly care about, but putting the United States at risk. So I don't know what the strategy is to get Bibi to be open to a proper definition of what winning looks like.
Look, I would say two things. One, define success by how do you end the war in Gaza. Two, take advantage of the dramatic weakness of Hezbollah right now, the absence of a leadership to reestablish Lebanese sovereignty. You convene the parliament, you elect the president, you have the Lebanese army reestablish itself, and then you also have a partner for ending the war in Lebanon. You have Hezbollah right now that is in complete disarray. Would find it very difficult to resist this if, in fact, we can get the Lebanese to realize there's a huge opportunity here for them.
Do you want to respond to this, or should we move to
I
Iran?
just want to say as to the entire point about Netanyahu. First of all, I just want to say factually, I've been extremely critical of Netanyahu, specifically during the negotiations towards a deal. And I published stories, I'm not talking about op-eds, but specific stories to corroborate that Netanyahu doesn't have the ambition to have a deal. And he's being accused by, or was accused by 50% of the Israeli public at least, as to that. I want to say another thing. Factually speaking, it is this administration that has been so critical of Netanyahu that says that the reason we're not having a deal right now is because of Sinwar, like Dennis also said here. And they came to that conclusion after two things that happened, and they happened in the same week. The first thing that happened is that Hamas murdered 6 hostages in a tunnel. Yeah. One of them is Hirsch Goldberg-Polin, an American citizen. And not only did they murder them, I'm telling you behind the scenes, the Hamas negotiators could have said this was a terrible mistake. They could have tried to signal that there was something wrong with the murder. No, they owned up to the murder. And I think that shocked the Americans in the process. And the second thing that happened, virtually in the same week, is that Hamas walked back on understandings that they already had with Israel as to the key of the Palestinian prisoners to be released for the hostages. And this gave the Americans, not the Israelis, the impression that Sinwar doesn't actually want to have a deal. Now, here's the thing. This is a nuanced situation when you have to negotiate between Hamas and between Israel. The US is there, Qatar is there, Egypt is there. It's a complicated situation. But the bottom line is that Hamas can end the war now. People should remember that because it's not about only moral clarity. It's also about diplomacy. I'm telling you this, I published this 7 months ago, that in the war cabinet with Benny Gantz and with Gadi Eisenkot and with the prime minister came up the proposal that Sinwar and his associates, the architects of the Israeli 9/11, will get immunity and will leave the Gaza Strip unharmed. And I published this story with no denial from the Prime Minister's office. And over time, this became an almost on-the-record position of the Israelis. Release the hostages, leave Gaza as Yasser Arafat left Beirut in 1982 to Tunis, get some sort of an immunity. It's not going to be a lifetime immunity, let me tell you that, Karen. But he knows that.
Well, I think he knows
That's
that.
not going to happen. and end the war. Yeah. And one of the problems that we're facing right now in the Middle East is that it is not about only a national struggle anymore. It's an identity issue, it's a fundamentalist issue, and because of that, it's so complex. So it doesn't come, we can criticize Netanyahu, for the way that he has handled this. But I believe, and not only the Americans believe, that if there would be a proposal on the table, and it would all rest on the Philadelphia corridor, we would have had a deal. And let me tell you why. Because the difference between what the Americans are suggesting as to the Philadelphia corridor and the difference between what the Israeli defense apparatus is suggesting are 4 outposts on about 9 miles. This is solvable.
Okay. Changing now to another actor in the region, and let's talk a little bit about Iran. So we've had conflicting reports about exactly what Iran knew about October 7, what was its involvement, but there's really no debate that for years Iran has been arming both Hamas and Hezbollah and other proxies that are now attacking Israel as well. Now, with the past year, Israel has been able to, as we talked about, the war against Hezbollah and Hamas, so Iran's proxies have been weakened. But we also know that Iran is closer than ever to having a nuclear weapon program. Now, for years, the United States really, especially since withdrawing from the JCPOA, there hasn't really been an Iran strategy or policy that was coherent. So let's just move to talk a little bit about Iran. Dennis, let's start with you. Overall, how has this war served Iran's interests? And of course, we're talking about this as Israeli decision makers are deliberating whether or not to retaliate and how to retaliate to the recent Iran's attacks. So what do you think is going to happen next with Iran?
So let's divide this in 2.
Yeah.
I would say until relatively recently, meaning until the killing of Nasrallah and the entire leadership of Hezbollah, I think the Iranians viewed this as a great success because it was isolating Israel internationally. Its narrative was taking on a kind of greater credibility. They could see what was going on in European capitals and on American campuses, and they saw basically things moving in a direction that made them very comfortable. Now suddenly they lose their most important proxy by far. And when I say that, it's an understatement. Nasrallah was a symbol. Nasrallah was almost as close to the supreme leader in Iran as Qasem Soleimani, who was the former head of the Quds Force. He was charismatic. You know, the Iranians used Hezbollah to train everybody else in the region. Here was one place where they had successfully exported the revolution, the Islamic Revolution. So to lose him is an unbelievable blow to their whole, what they call the axis of resistance. I actually call it the axis of misery. Because if you look at every single one of their proxies and the states they're in, all those states are in, they're either failed, failing, or paralyzed.
Right.
So if this is what you want for your future, sign up to that axis. And now suddenly, this most important asset they had is gone. You can bet that the Iranians have their own doubts about what Israel knows about them. Haniyeh is killed in downtown Tehran at a Revolutionary Guard safe house when their president's being inaugurated. 55,000 documents were ferreted out of downtown Tehran, out of a warehouse. It was the nuclear archive of Iran. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was the lead of their nuclear program, the guy who was kind of the spearhead of it, he's assassinated in Israel even though he has 24/7 protection. I mean, he's assassinated in Iran even though he has 24/7 protection. So they don't know what the Israelis also know about them. And yet, as you said, actually in your introduction, they've crossed 2 thresholds on night of April 13th and then last week. They didn't use their proxies, and then instead they attacked directly. First, why would they do it? And I think the main reason that they did it was because they fear, and especially the Revolutionary Guard, fears the image of weakness. And the image of weakness, not only that it sends to their proxies, but to their own public. Right. What comes first for this Iranian regime is regime survival. And if it looks like they're so weak that they can't respond when they're attacked, then they worry about what that means domestically. Now, having said everything I just said, the language they have used after the strike was exactly the same language they used on the night of April 13th. We're finished. We've done what we needed to do. And if Israel retaliates, there'll be a crushing response. They don't want this to go into an all-out war any more than Israel wants it to go into an all-out war. But even though neither side wants it to go into an all-out war, neither side wants to look weak. And so how do you strike the balance there in a way that allows the Iranians, after they're hit by the Israelis, very much will depend upon the nature of how they're hit. Personally, I think there are things the Israelis could hit, like the bases where the missiles came from, like all the stockpiles of missiles, but I'd also like to see a cyber attack that basically shuts down the Iranian economy. You're trying to send a message to the Iranian leadership, we can do things to you, and we're going to signal you just how much we can do without doing all of that. This is the only thing I think that's going to contain the nature of the response.
So there's a lot of talk about Iran and the nuclear program too. I don't know that we will have time, but let's move for a second to Saudi Arabia and the prospect of normalization with Israel that is still on the table, with the idea that, from what I understand, that a pathway towards a Palestinian state will be kind of part of a deal, a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. So Jane, from your perspective, how would the normalization deal look like? And how do you think the chances are for this to happen?
Can I say one more thing about Iran? And that is, Iran doesn't want to look weak, but Iran is weak. And I think we have overestimated what Iran is able to do. Yes, they're almost at nuclear breakout. My view, which is probably unpopular here, I think the JCPOA was working. I didn't think it was a perfect deal, but I think it was working on the nuclear piece. It was containing the nuclear program. It wasn't whatever Obama was imagining, revolutionizing the way Iran was going to look at its role in the Middle East. But at any rate, I think that sanctions, I think that the shock and awe that was just accomplished by Israel in Lebanon, I think these selective murders of top targets in Iran have really shaken the regime, which is not a popular regime. And I think they have to be very careful. I still am loving what Dennis said about we need the right definition of success, and then we can get everyone in the room. So to Saudi, I have always praised the Trump administration for the Abraham Accords. I think that was the right thing to do. And I think what Biden was trying to do before October 7 was expand on that and develop a more serious relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel based on an economic understanding, and also the price for that on the Saudi side was a U.S. umbrella and some things that were, I think, not popular in the United States Congress for sure. And the JCPOA wasn't popular either. It was never a treaty. It was just an agreement because Congress would not approve it. Congress did not disapprove it, but it was a piece of art which enabled Trump to end it. But at any rate, I think that what would this look like? What could this look like? I think it could be terrific. And I think Israel has, for years, Dennis would know all the particulars, you probably both do, had emissaries, not just to Saudi Arabia, but to the Sunni Arab world, working on the relationship. So I hope we can get back to that or forward to that. The stumbling block now, and this relates to something I said before, is that at least MBS is saying no deal without some vision for two states. I personally favor that. But Bibi doesn't. So again, I think Bibi, once again, doesn't want to make a deal, and it's stalled.
So, I've looked at the questions from the audience. So we have a question, is a two-state solution still possible, and how? And thinking about this in the context of a possible normalization deal with the language toward a pathway, do you see this? Do you see the conditions for this politically in Israel?
The Israeli political domestic framework right now will not allow any sort of real, tangible developments towards Palestinian statehood. And I don't see it in the near future. Now, saying in the near future in the Middle East means absolutely nothing. That's the truth. But right now, domestic politics in Israel basically sounds like this. Look, we have tried unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. Hamas played its hand with this, presented itself as the victor, and presented the Israelis as surrendering, even though it was Ariel Sharon who did that, and it was, his initiative. And this is one of the reasons for Hamas gaining strength within the Palestinian street, and for Hamas eventually having its coup d'etat in the Gaza Strip. We have withdrawn from southern Lebanon at the time. This was not completely unilateral. This was with the UN Security Council decision, actually acknowledging that Israel withdrew to some sort of a border. I don't want to say an international border because, as Amos Hochstein said in the IGP last week, there are several international borders between Israel and Lebanon. You can pick your color, right? But then again, Hezbollah and the axis of resistance only grew stronger. Israelis thinking about the possibility of Palestinian statehood, the even mention of this by the international community makes Israelis extremely angry. They say, with whom? With more than 50% of the Palestinian public in the West Bank that supports Hamas and says that October 7 was legitimate? How can you do that? Now, these are valid questions, and I respect those questions. And I think that you need to do with what you have. And what the Saudis, if you listen very intentionally to what they're saying, they're not saying we need to have a Palestinian state. They're saying we need to have a process, and we need to have a date, and we need to have a direction. And this sounds like George W. Bush and Ariel Sharon roadmap. If you remember, first there needs to stop incitement, then there needs to be a verification of incitement, then there needs to be a collection of weapons, then there needs to be a verification. And until we finish this, it's going to take a long time, it's not going to happen, right? So I would say that this is where we are at right now. So if it rests on the Saudis saying we need to have an exact specific date in 2026 of a declaration of independence, I'm sorry to disappoint those who are waiting for someone to replace Netanyahu, but Benny Gantz, Naftali Bennett, or Yair Lapid, they're not going to agree to that. Right. They simply do not have the political audience in Israel today to agree to that. So one of the things that we need to have is realistic aims of the sort that American diplomacy used to have. And I'm looking at Dennis because, I'm thinking about Henry Kissinger. I'm thinking about the agreements that Kissinger brought after 1973, which were really the basis for the Camp David Accords at the time with Egypt. I'm thinking about getting things done that will prevent people from being killed, but not necessarily will garner the president with a Nobel Peace Prize of the sorts. And I'm saying this not because I don't want peace in the Middle East, but because I need to look at the different collection of societies that we're facing.
So talking about Kissinger presidents with maybe a new vision, a new initiative, a new way of thinking about the Middle East puzzle. Jane, let me ask you, how do you see the election of kind of a possible future President Harris versus Trump changing the trajectory of the war?
Yeah.
Yes, Jane. Simple, subtle question.
Well,
You're among friends.
Yeah. Thanks, Dennis. Same to you, buddy. So Henry Kissinger used to call me his Jewish mother. We sat next to each other on the Defense Policy Board for a decade, and for those of you who knew him, he would nod off, but he wasn't really sleeping. But I would go get him coffee and a cookie, after this happened. And not too far into this, he said, you know, you're my mother. You're my Jewish mother. And that led to this shtick going on forever. So that was quite delicious. And I think we miss him. I would be very curious to know how he would answer this question. So 30 days in politics is years, just in case anyone has missed this. As one who ran for office as many times as I did, 19 elections, 20 elections, actually. I lost an election for governor of California, but I won 19 elections, including primaries for Congress, and they were no slam dunks. It was pretty hard. And at the end, I had a safer Democratic seat, so of course I was opposed from the left, and my opponent who was Jewish, gave her T-shirt to the flotilla in Turkey, which was trying to take back Gaza. Anyway, I was called a traitor and a spy, and I should be in jail, so this is who I am. But at least I'm not in jail. But more seriously, I don't know how to call this. And I don't think it's over. And I don't know how to call how either candidate winning the election, and let's understand this may be months, right. And we may have litigation and et cetera, see a worse movie than we saw last time. I don't know how this goes. But I think both candidates are committed to the existence of Israel. Both of them have said so. Both of them have reasons to be committed to the existence of Israel. How will they feel about the other issues? I don't think we really know enough. I know the Biden administration just provided substantial aid, humanitarian aid to the citizens of Lebanon. I actually support that. Again, I know some of you probably don't, but I think there is a chance that a viable Lebanon could emerge from this. I think Dennis said that. And if that happened, that could be a game changer instead of a failed state, which is where we are at the moment. So actually there could be, don't we all remember when Lebanon had a government and when Beirut was the Paris of the Middle East? Yes, we do. So I'm punting because I really don't see clearly what each of them will do. And I don't think we will know until this election is over. May it please be over. And we see, and it's a month from now also. What else is going to happen in the region in the month? So I just think there are too many, as Rumsfeld used to say, unknown unknowns.
Dennis? I know, you were hoping to avoid this question.
I don't do elections. I actually wanted to pick up on something that Dov said.
Go for it, and then we have the last question for the evening.
Look, what you described about the Israeli body politic is completely understandable because there's a perception that if there's a Palestinian state, it'll be led by Hamas or Hamas-like groups. So they're traumatized, but so is the Palestinian public. They're traumatized as well. When you have societies that are traumatized, they're consumed by their own pain and incapable of feeling the other sides. So the idea that we can negotiate two states anytime soon is not realistic. Having said that, we do need to be very clear that the alternative to two states is one state. And one state is a guarantee for a perpetual conflict. We have two national movements competing for the same space. We have two national identities deeply rooted, connected to the land. Neither one is ever going to give it up. The idea that they would coexist in one state is a complete illusion. Look around the Middle East. Every place where you have more than one identity, national, tribal, or sectarian, that state is at war with itself, paralyzed, or bound for failure. That's not what we should hope for Israelis and Palestinians. So part of the task, even in terms of Israel, is to explain to Israelis, one state is not the answer. One state actually will further isolate you if it's run by the Messianic nationalists who want one state because they think the Palestinians will disappear, either because they're encouraged to leave or because they'll disappear. So that's an illusion. What is not is building from the ground up, having some kind of vision you can offer. What has always been needed is a top-down approach that offers at least the vision of a pathway, and a bottom-up approach that shows that what you're talking about is not an abstraction. Right now, when the war ends, we have to focus on something practical. Israelis and Palestinians can cooperate on issues that are functional, health issues, water issues, environmental issues. Focus on those things where you can show Israelis and Palestinians actually working together. Because right now, Israelis and Palestinians can't envision that. We have to reestablish a sense of what's possible. It'll take a lot to do that, but that is not impossible.
Thank you. So now the last question. If you had to predict, where are we on October 6, 2025? Nadav, Jane, Dennis.
I'm not going to predict what's going to happen next week. No, I'm serious. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if Israel. There's an internal discussion within Israel. Is this the right time to tackle the Iranian nuclear issue? I don't think that this is a spin. I think this is a serious discussion. This can change the face of the Middle East again. There's going to be some sort of response, and then the supreme leader in Iran will need to make up his mind if this is going to be a full-blown war. The tendencies of the past, the patterns of the past are all we have when we look into the future. And the patterns are that these kinds of events in the Middle East usually lead, after a certain period of time, to there's some sort of pause. And usually a longer pause than people actually think. I'm thinking of the 2006 war. I'm thinking about the Second Intifada and what happened after the Second Intifada. I'm thinking about the First Intifada, the Yom Kippur War. I can go, and actually, if you think about the Yom Kippur War and the 6 Days War, they're always so. But it's only 6 years, so there was the War of Attrition in the middle. So it was a one constant war, if you actually think about that. And because of that, I want to be hopeful. But the reason I want to be hopeful, and I force myself to be hopeful, is because I'm Israeli. Because I choose Israel.
Yeah.
I choose Israel. And Israel is such an unlikely story in the region. And let me tell you what is unlikely. It's very unlikely, highly unlikely, that after Sinwar will declare its flood of Al-Aqsa, and Israel will reoccupy the Gaza Strip, and dozens of thousands of Palestinians will die in the process, that Israel will retain its relations with every single Arab country like it has retained, and that, air carriers coming from the Gulf will continue on flying when air carriers coming from Europe will stop flying to Tel Aviv. So because of that, when you decide to be part of the Middle Eastern story, like Dennis has decided and has toiled for so many years, having peace in the region, you have to be dedicated to the idea that you force yourself into hope, even in these times. And it's actually, I hear a lot of cries in campuses about what Zionism is about. And almost all of them are completely untrue. But this is exactly, to an extent, what Zionism is about. It's about clinging to hope when there's sometimes absolutely no reason to be with it. And I think that for us Israelis, this is what it means right now. I'm speaking with my friends. They sometimes are in shelters, including this evening, with their kids. And they're clinging to, it's going to be better. Yeh beseder. Okay, at a certain point. And this is a very Israeli mood.
So I want to be optimistic for 3 reasons. The first is, God willing, it will be my son's 52nd birthday, and I want him and his family to be healthy and happy, and my other 3 children as well. So that would be one reason. Secondly, my own father was a refugee from Nazi Germany and was so moved by the formation of Israel and loved Israel. And I want this for him, and I want it for all Israelis. But third, this is my more pessimistic side. I don't think it's just going to be up to the parties in the Middle East. It's a dangerous world, and China and Russia are watching this, and they're watching the disarray in our country. And I'm coming back to this report that I just was part of, 8 of us, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, unanimously saying that we have the most dangerous and complex world since World War II. That's even before the formation of Israel. And I worry that one or both of those countries will take advantage of this uncertain moment. And it won't be up to the Middle East what is going on in the world in a year, but it will affect the Middle East.
Dennis?
So, look, I'm congenitally an optimist because I've spent 40 years working on this issue. So, as my wife says when people say, gee, he's really committed, she says, well, he ought to be committed. You know, we can be, I don't believe in being pessimistic, I believe in being realistic. So on the one hand, you have to plan against the worst things that can happen. You never hope for the best and plan for the best. You always plan for the worst. But I also think it's a huge mistake not to see potential openings when they're there. And there is a potential opening now. Because of the weakening of Hamas, because of the weakening of Hezbollah, and however what happens over the next week or so, if that is contained a certain way, I believe there actually will be an opening. There is an opening now to remake Lebanon and have it recapture its sovereignty and end the hold that Hezbollah had over it. There will be an opening at the end of the war to remake Gaza without Hamas being in control. There is a potential opening for a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal, which will not take place if there is not a Palestinian dimension to it. Now, all of that creates a real possibility for change. I can paint a scenario a year from now that is very hopeful. I can also paint a scenario that has us essentially where we are, with Israel having been caught up in a series of wars of attrition. I wrote an article 2 weeks ago where I basically said, it's not in Israel's interest to play into Iran's strategy for Israel, which is to consume it with wars of attrition. So this gets back to, I think, part of your introduction, or something you said in one of the opening questions. Israel has extraordinary military achievements right now. It needs to think about political outcomes so those military achievements become translatable and become more endurable.
So it's fair to say, like Madeleine Albright used to say, that we're optimists but we like to worry a lot, right? And so, so we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the 92nd Street Y for hosting us.